In this video, I'm going to show you how I went from managing a single Snowflake Jenkins server to a fleet of ephemeral Jenkins servers by using Docker. Hey everybody, this is Fabio Gomez-Diaz. Welcome to my YouTube channel where I will teach you skills that can get you a six-figure job in the tech industry. Have you ever upgraded your Jenkins servers only to discover that you broke all of your pipelines? Are you struggling to maintain a fleet of Jenkins servers? Do some of your pipelines work on some Jenkins servers, but not others? If you said yes to any of the above, don't worry, I know your pain because I've been there too. But see, that's when I learned that something needed to change. And that's when I discovered that you can run Jenkins inside Docker, but also you can run Jenkins pipelines within Docker. Now watch until the end of the video so that I can show you exactly how to run this from your workstation. Now before we do that, let's get into a quick overview of Jenkins. Now Jenkins is an industry standard automation server that's open source that's typically used for continuous integration and continuous delivery, better known as CI/CD, for applications of any type. In other words, you can use Jenkins to pull your application code, build it, test it, and deploy it to your own infrastructure. Now, your infrastructure can be your own workstation, a server in the cloud, or a Kubernetes cluster where your application will be running as a container. Now, all these steps can be run inside Jenkins as pipelines, and you can define these pipelines using Jenkins files that you can check into your code repository and iterate over it. Now, Jenkins files can save you a lot of time because all you have to do is connect your Jenkins job to your code repository, a one-time step, then you write your Jenkins file, another one-time step, and you have a Jenkins job that will run your CI/CD pipelines the way you want them to run, as many times as you want to. And of course, you can always change your Jenkins file as needed. And the best thing is that Jenkins can show you a changelog for the Jenkins file so that you can see who did what, when, and where. Lastly, as your needs grow, Jenkins can be configured to have a master node that delegates work across multiple worker nodes. Now this sounds great, but if you ever had to run and maintain your own Jenkins server, you know that it comes with its own set of problems. For example, Jenkins runs on Java, which means that you have to install and maintain a specific version of Java that may or may not work with existing applications in your server. You also have to maintain your own Jenkins servers along with the corresponding plugins. Now, upgrading Jenkins and its plugins to incompatible versions may render your own Jenkins server unusable, and you may have to restart it from scratch. And if you run multiple versions of Jenkins or multiple Jenkins servers, you're going to have to implement those changes across all those Jenkins servers, which can be a problem. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, but we can do better than that without having to restart Jenkins from scratch. Now this is where Docker comes in. Now let's do a quick intro on Docker so that you can understand how it works and how it can help you test multiple versions of Jenkins and Jenkins plugins in the same server without breaking your running Jenkins server. Now, Docker is a container engine that allows you to use Linux technologies to wrap your application and its dependencies into an image by using a set of instructions known as a Docker file. Now, from this image, we can create containers that run into any operating system that has Docker installed, which eliminates problems such as the infamous "it works in my machine" compared to virtual machines, which virtualize the hardware to run multiple operating systems in the same server. Containers virtualize the operating system, virtual or bare metal, to start multiple containers in the same operating system. This means that containers can start your application immediately because there isn't an overhead of starting a new VM for each application. Now you know about Jenkins and Docker. So how can Docker help me save time and headaches by running Jenkins as a container? Now, since you can pretty much package anything into a container, you bet that the open source community has already tried packaging Jenkins into a container, and they had different images for multiple versions of Jenkins, including new ones that are published on public repositories like Docker Hub. This means that you can start a container for a specific version of Jenkins that suits your needs, and in the future, when a new version of Jenkins comes along that you would like to try, you can do so by starting a new container for that specific version of Jenkins in the same machine as your original Jenkins instance without having to break in it or run into Java compatibility issues. Now that's convenient. Now the last and perhaps the most important benefit of using Docker for Jenkins is that Docker itself can be used by Jenkins to create containers that will behave as the worker nodes by using the Docker workflow plugin. For example, you can create a worker node container that's going to be specifically used to run CI/CD pipelines for Java applications, and you can do the same thing on a separate container to do the same thing for Python applications. Now, there are benefits to using this approach, which include but are not limited to the following: increased security, because using a Docker and Docker container to host Jenkins agents instead of the host computer's Docker engine more on that later, can prevent a compromised container from taking over the host computer's Docker engine. Now, another benefit you get is reduced compute resources because the containerized Jenkins agents are ephemeral, which means that they are only deployed when the pipeline starts and are immediately destroyed once the pipeline is finished. And lastly, you get repeatable infrastructure because all of the moving parts are containerized, which means that you can start any part of your Jenkins infrastructure in seconds and know exactly what's in it. No more guessing and no more manual work. All right, everybody, let's jump right into the architecture of what we will be building today. Now, first things first, I'll try to keep the diagram as simple as possible. So what you see here in this big box, first and foremost, is the Docker host, but also the Docker engine that's going to be running in the host computer, which in this case will probably be your workstation. So this is going to be Docker. Then on your right side, you're going to see the Docker and Docker containers. So it's kind of a Docker inception in here, but Docker on the host will be deploying its own Docker daemon container. And then we're going to deploy a Jenkins container. And then what's going to happen is that once we deploy Jenkins, which by the way, will have the Docker workflow plugin installed, this Jenkins master, we will be using it to set up pipelines. And then once the pipeline is running, it's going to ask the Docker and Docker container to deploy a Jenkins agent that's going to have different things installed. Ignore this Packer logo, but it could have Java, it could have Gradle, it could have Maven, it could have the Docker CLI. So we're going to be providing an image that the Docker and Docker container will use to deploy a Docker agent. And then in one of the steps that you'll see, we're going to be building a Docker image, which is going to be pulling a base image from Docker Hub. And then once the pipeline runs, it's going to return results to the Jenkins master container, and then it's going to disappear. So that's what we will be doing today. First things first, I created an accompanying document on my GitHub repository for the YouTube channel that goes over all the steps that we'll be doing today. So if you ever need to refer back to them to understand what's going on, here's the link, which I'll share in the description below. All right, so first things first, we need to go to the appropriate directory in our command line, which I'm already in. Then we're going to create a Jenkins network in Docker. So what this is going to allow us to do is to use the simple DNS names to refer to Jenkins or to refer to Docker. So don't worry about this too much. We'll just go ahead and do it. Then we're going to create a volume called Docker client certs. So this is going to have the client certificates that Jenkins will need to connect to Docker in a secure manner. So we're going to create this volume. Then we're going to create a volume to hold the Jenkins data. This is going to be used primarily to just back up the Jenkins data. So if for some reason we do something and Jenkins crashes, when we restart it, we'll have the data as long as we have this volume. Then we're going to start the Docker and Docker container. That's what it does right here. So first things first, you'll notice that we're going to be using the Jenkins network. We're going to use a network alias of Docker so that from Jenkins, when we need to refer to the Docker daemon, we'll just simply say Docker instead of an IP address that we'll have to look up every time. We're going to publish ports 2376 onto our machine's port as 2376. Here is the path within the Docker daemon that's going to hold the certificates. Here's going to be the Jenkins data volume that we're going to be mounting to it, and then we're going to be mounting the Docker client certs volume to it at this location. So once this is mounted, Docker is going to populate the client certificates at this folder. So first, this is the base folder for the certificates, and then the volume that's going to take the client certs is going to be mounted or be taken at this path in the Docker and Docker container. This is just the Docker image, and then the storage driver, which we don't really talk about in this video. Now let's go ahead and start it. Okay. We do Docker PS, you're going to see that the Docker and Docker container is running. And if we do Docker log/f for follow, you're going to see that it is started, right? Daemon has completed initialization, is ready to be used. Now the next step will be to build the image for the Jenkins master. So I'm going to copy this, but now I'm going to show you the actual code. So we're not just going to be deploying a vanilla Jenkins, we're going to build a container that uses the latest base image as shown right here. And then we're going to install the Docker workflow container. We're just going to build it with it installed so that we don't have to manually install it every time. So Nothing crazy going on in this Docker image. We're going to be pulling from the official Jenkins image. We're going to install a few utilities that are going to help us with the installation of the container. We're going to be adding a few GPG keys for the Docker repo. This is basically going to allow us to install the Docker client on Jenkins, so don't worry about that too much. And then once we do all this setup, then we get the update and install the Docker CLI, which is what we want, right? This is how Jenkins is going to connect to the Docker and Docker container to then provision or deploy new Jenkins agents. And then finally here we install the Docker workflow plugin, which is going to make it easier for Jenkins to communicate with the Docker CLI. Now let's go ahead and build the image. We have to go to the Jenkins folder, then we type this command and it's going to build the image. Now in my case the image was already cached, so no issues there. If we do Docker images, we're going to see that we have the Jenkins with Docker image, right? That's the one that we just built. I mean, it says created 8 days ago because we already cached it, but you get what I'm trying to say. And there it is. Now what we need to do is start the container. So we're going to copy this command to start the Jenkins container. Then we're going to run it. And while it starts, I'll show you that we're going to call the container Jenkins. It's going to run in the background. It's going to be using the Jenkins network. It's going to be published at this port 8080 or 5000. And it's going to have these environment variables set up to communicate with the Docker and Docker container. So remember how I mentioned that we will be referencing to the Docker daemon as simply Docker. Now here's how we specify the hostname for the Docker daemon. Now the other thing to look at is this volume. Remember we talked about populating the Jenkins data volume to back up our Jenkins configuration. And then here's perhaps the most important part. We're going to mount the Docker client certs volume that we created early so that Jenkins can have the correct certificates in order to communicate with the Docker daemon container. All right, so it's been deployed. If we do Docker logs and then we say Jenkins, we should be able to see that it started, all right? So first things we need to do is we need to copy this admin password from the logs, or I have a command to copy that password for you. So we can just do this. It's gonna run a docker exec command and it's gonna run the cat command to print that password for you. So we can just do this. Okay, and then here it is the password. Same password as this one. So we'll copy it. Then we'll go to our browser and open another tab with localhost. We're gonna paste the password. Then we're going to click continue. We're not gonna do any customization to Jenkins other than what we already did with the Docker image. So we're just gonna install suggested plugins and then just let it run for a while. Now I'm gonna skip the video because this is gonna take a little while. All right, once we're in this screen, it's gonna ask us to create an admin user. We're not gonna do that in this video. We're gonna keep things as simple as possible. So click on skip and continue as admin. It's gonna ask you what is the URL that you're gonna use to refer to Jenkins. We're just gonna use localhost. We're not gonna do anything fancy. So we're gonna click save and finish. Now it's gonna say that the setup is complete. Jenkins is ready. Click on start using Jenkins. All right, now we're in Jenkins. Now what do we do next? First things first, we're going to set up a couple of environment variables, okay? Now the next thing we're gonna be doing is we're going to get the IP address for the Docker and Docker container. Now I mentioned that we did not need to do that, but that only applies to the Jenkins network that we created in the Docker host. When we deploy Jenkins agents, it's going to be a different network on a different Docker daemon. So this doesn't apply, right? So we're going to need to use this image and you'll see where that's useful later. But first we're going to copy this command. We're going to go to our command line. We're going to paste the command and boom, we have the IP address of the Docker and Docker daemon. Now, what we need to do is we need to go to Jenkins, click on manage Jenkins, configure system, then we go to global properties and we're going to set an environment variable. Let's make this a little bigger. We're going to paste the IP address and we're going to call this environment variable, Docker host IP. Just double check. It is Docker host IP. Now we click save. And we're good to go. Now, anytime that we deploy a new Jenkins agent and it needs to communicate back to the Docker in Docker daemon container, it'll know what IP address to use. Now, the next thing that we'll be doing is we're going to create a job in Jenkins. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to click new item. We're going to call it Docker pipeline. Oops, we're going to call it Docker pipeline. We're going to say it is a pipeline. We're going to press OK. And then we're going to specify where the Jenkins file is. And we'll get to that Jenkins file in a bit. First, we scroll down on the job configuration page. We scroll down to pipeline and we select the pipeline script from SCM. That means source control management. Then we say git. Then here we get to specify the URL where we're going to be pulling our Jenkins file. So first we copy it. It's going to be the same repository I showed you earlier. It is a public repository, so it doesn't require any credentials to clone the repo. Okay, now we're going to be using the main branch to copy our Jenkins file from, and then we're going to copy this path to the Jenkins file in the repository. We're going to put, this is the path, so in this folder, Jenkins file. Now we click on save, and we're basically good to go. Now, before I start a build on the pipeline, I'm going to show you what the pipeline itself looks like in the Jenkins file. So we're going to go back to the repository. We're going to click here. And this is the Jenkins file that we'll be running. So it's pretty straightforward. So I'm not going to talk much about what the Jenkins files look like, but we will cover what this one looks like. So right now we're going to be looking at the Jenkins file. Now you're going to notice two stages in this pipeline. You're going to notice the Gradle build and you're going to notice the build Docker image stage. So there's only two stages, but it'll be enough for the demonstration. Now the first stage is a Gradle build. So you're going to notice the agent. This is the place where we specify which image we'll be using to run our Jenkins agent for this specific step or stage. Notice that we're going to be using the Gradle 7.5 JDK 11. Now this is an image, a Docker image that's public. It's public on Docker Hub. We're going to be pulling that image the way it is, no changes, and we're going to be using it to run these steps. So first it's going to go to the Jenkins and Docker app directory, which is this right here. This is just a simple Spring Boot application that I downloaded from Spring Boot Initializer website. There's nothing to it. So let's not go over that. I actually have a previous video that's going to be shown right here or right here, where you're going to learn more about Docker files and I'll cover this application more in detail. So you'll click on that link. All right. So all we're going to be doing in this line is to do the Gradle build, right? We're going to skip any unit test. We're just going to do a simple Gradle build and you're going to see how it works. Then once we are done with this stage, we're going to go into the build Docker image stage, which is going to use this public image is going to be the Docker client version 2010-18. Then we're going to be passing it some environment variables. For example, we're going to be passing it the certificates folder, right? For the client, for the Docker client certificates, which we mounted in a previous step, as you recall. Then we're going to pass the Docker host IP, which we set up in Jenkins earlier, so that the Docker client knows which Docker daemon to use to build the Docker image, which I'll show you how it does it in the next step. And then the settings are just to turn on TLS validation or verification. Now that's it. Now, same thing as in the previous step, we're going to go to the Jenkins and Docker app folder and we're going to do a Docker build command. And this is going to build our image. All right. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and start a build on Jenkins. And what you see on the right is going to be, let me just start this over. We're going to be printing the logs for the Docker and Docker daemon so that you can see what happens as the build is running. So first, we're just going to go ahead and print it the way it is. I'm going to clear the output. I'm going to click build now. You're going to see a build that is scheduled. I'm going to click right there and I'm going to hit console. Now, first things first is going to pull the Gradle image that I showed you earlier on the Gradle step or stage. Then it started a new image, right? Then it started the Gradle build commands. Now this is going to take a while because it's going to start the Gradle daemon to build the application. So it started it, it built the application, it did that really fast. And it's going to move on to the next stage, which is to build an image for that same application. And as you can see, remember this image, the Docker client image is going to pull it. And as you can see, there were some logs that happened because of that as well. And then it's going to run the steps. Very simple step. First things first, it's going to go to the same folder as in the previous stage. And then it's going to run this step, which is a Docker build. It's going to build a new image. It's going to run the same Gradle build step, but now from within the Docker image. And then it's going to build it. And then it's going to pull this image from within the Docker file. And then boom, it finished the image. And there you go. With the knowledge you learned today, you should now be able to build and run your own version-specific Jenkins container and build and run your own custom Jenkins agents with the help of the Docker and Docker container. If you want to learn more about Docker and Docker files, click on my multi-stage Docker build video over here and click on the description below if you want to get a link for the GitHub repository that we use in this video to run the same instructions that we run in this video on your workstation. Bye now.